Welcome to Fun and First. Today we are going to be continuing our kind of mini series here on some advanced React component patterns. We've talked about recursive components, we've talked about unstyled components. Last week we talked about controlled and uncontrolled components. And this week we're talking about render props. So, yeah, what do you think about render props?
Love hate relationship with them. You see them and you're like, oh, this is really cool. This is like an awesome API. And then I start adding them to my app, and all of a sudden, like, I just have a crazy app that I have components that take JSX, components that take functions, really hard to follow. I've kind of had this swing in the last, I don't know, couple years where it's like I don't want to use them. I want to use things like hooks, and I want to use to our episode last week. I just want to take full control over the component, and we kind of did a bunch of prep for this episode, and I think we found some like nice little examples that where like I'm like really excited about render props. So like coming into this episode, I was very like I don't want render props too fancy. Just give me the basics. Um, but yeah, so I guess that's how I feel about them.
I think it's a great perspective, and I think the point about the complexity. If you do look at a big component, a big page component, for example, and you're using a lot of render props, it almost feels like another programming language inside of your programming language. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's like this point where like there's kind of that like what is it, that like 50% meme where it's like the noob and the Jedi and the
The
person in
midwit
the
meme.
middle, the midwit meme. I think there's like a midwit meme that's like the noob and the Jedi both are saying just pass JSX to components, and then you have the midwit saying no, you should be able to customize blah blah blah. I've worked on projects where like we basically created our own template language inside children, and there were reasons for it, right? Like there were reasons for it. There were good business reasons for it. But man, that stuff gets really, really complex. And at some point, you look at it and you're like, wow, this is way more complex than we wanted. And I think render props are a form of that, where it's like it's not JSX. You're passing in your own thing. Could be your own programming language, could be just JavaScript functions, but it's different than JSX. And there's complexity there.
Dude, I think it's a great point. I think there's a lot of stuff in that midwit meme where I can just make a new component during the render of this component, and I can curry arguments to it, and then that's what when you're so excited about all this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was me. Like that's me. Like you start to understand React and you see all this stuff that it unlocks. And then you kind of like, then later on you realize like, okay, yeah, it's actually way harder to be like the responsible React programmer. But
Right.
again, the reason I'm excited about this week's episode is I think there are some pretty cool use cases where to use render props. So it's almost like you make the mistake where you try to make everything a render prop or everything like you're passing your own programming language, like you said, to a component, and then you get to filter out all the times where you overdid it, and you end up with a small subset where it's like it's awesome and it works great. So
Yeah, well said. Um, so, okay, let's talk about render props. Let's talk about what they are, where they came from. And I think most folks have probably seen them, probably in libraries that they've used. And especially a couple years ago, especially before hooks came out, render props were a way to share some stateful logic um, with other components and other parts of your app. And they kind of went hand in hand with unstyled components as a pattern for how to share behavior and stateful logic with your app just by rendering a component. So one example I like to think of is something like a Wi-Fi status. You know, before hooks existed and we only had components, you could make a Wi-Fi status, online status component. It could render something like a green indicator if it's on, a red indicator if it's off, and you could render that anywhere. That's pretty cool. But people might want to change the rendering logic for that component. And before hooks, we didn't have a nice way to do that. So people first made it unstyled, which we talked about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And then second, they exposed the status of the Wi-Fi via a render prop. And so if you haven't seen it before, you would render Wi-Fi status. And then, like you said, inside of the children, instead of rendering a tag, you could render a function. And the function yields an argument. The argument usually is an object, which you can destructure props from it. And it would have something like is online. And then you can return new JSX that is conditional. If it's online, you return your own green indicator. If it's off, you return your own red indicator. But this way, the Wi-Fi status component doesn't have any opinions about the actual styling of the result.
And yeah, and the Wi-Fi status component can be like an npm library that anyone can use because we all get to control the styling. We all get to take what it yielded to us and then style our template, our component with it.
Exactly. So this whole idea of like these two ideas coming together of sharing behavior and being able to render an unstyled component were a really powerful way to share behavioral stateful logic in React. Then hooks came out, in large part as a way to accomplish this kind of in a first party way. Render props were one way to do this. Higher order components were another, but both of those had issues that they were concerned with rendering inside the tree. Whereas if you think about it, hooks are a way to grab the Wi-Fi status at the top of your component, where you're kind of doing your transformation logic, some behavior, some stateful stuff, setting up event handlers, and now you can just get the Wi-Fi status as a reactive variable, right? As a stateful variable that triggers re-renders, and now I can just use it to customize the JSX. And so hooks replaced unstyled render props as a way to share stateful logic and behavior, which probably was 50 to 70% of the use cases for render props.
Yeah. I like something you said before, which is like you're using a component, but the Wi-Fi status isn't actually part of the tree. It's not part of the render tree. So it makes sense it would be a hook. And that's something that like really clicked with me in the past.
Nice.
So.
Yep. I think when we introduce hooks, and for folks who are still learning it, like the right times and places to use hooks, hooks really aren't about rendering in this narrow sense. They are about rendering because they're in React, and all of React is about rendering, but they aren't about the pixels on the screen. They are about behavior and state and logic that are eventually influence the pixels on the screen, but only indirectly, not directly. So you're trying to share some behavior you want to use, and that's what a hook is great for. So we had render props. We were using them for all sorts of cool hooks like this. You could get the mouse position. I remember we had like a mouse position component, and you could destructure the X and Y, and you could basically nest these things, and so that they compose. But again, it's awkward to put them into a tree data structure because it's really more horizontal. It's really more horizontal composition that you want. You just want access to all those things at the same level of indentation, and then you can perform your logic on it. So that was a huge benefit of hooks. And so hooks really replaced render props for all those sorts of use cases. So what remained? Why are render props still here? Why are they still mentioned in the React docs? Why are we talking about them in our upcoming course? So what else is left? Well, if you're not talking about just state or behavior, which hooks are the best solution for, what you should be using, what's left? One thing that's left is to customize the styling of a reusable component at the call site. So you have a reusable component, let's say like a drop-down menu from Radix, from Headless UI, from React Aria, and those are unstyled, but they do render things. They belong in the tree because they're rendering an unordered list, and they have specific constraints around the structure of the HTML for it all to work. So that makes sense that those are in components. But you want to customize them a little bit. And library authors can add props for lightweight customizations, things like, variant classic or variant bootstrap or variant material UI, and then maybe they just apply some styles. But a way to drop down and get even more control and kind of improve the composition of these libraries is to use render props. And the render props are going to yield out that internal state, but give you more control to customize the JSX yourself. So this would be something like a drop-down menu from Radix. You render the items, and then when an item is selected, like if you're navigating with the keyboard, you want to apply some style to that. You want to add like background blue 500 when it's when it's active, right? Or when it's selected, you want
Mhm.
to make it green or something like that. So after hooks came out and we got rid of the Wi-Fi status components on npm and we replaced them with use Wi-Fi status hooks on npm, we still had render props for the drop-down menu, and but still, that's maybe the remaining. That's like 20 or 30% of the use case. And these days, we don't really use render props for things like toggling classes. So why is that? What are we moving on from there?
Um, well, I think I first saw this when I started using Radix, but Radix uses data attributes for styling classes, and the render prop for styling classes is nice. Do you want to pull up I've always liked the headless UI. They were
Yes,
like the first UI library I used that use these render props a lot. Um,
we got
yeah,
the screen
you've
share
got a
on for folks watching on YouTube, but I'm looking at the menu component from headless UI, and here we're looking at rendering a menu and seeing that the menu button yields out an active boolean as a render prop, and that lets us, the callers, add a background blue 200 if active is true.
Yep, and same with focus. Well, it's looping over all the menu items. When one is focused, we can it'll give us a prop focused as true or false, and we can use that to control the styling. Um, so your question was what are we using now, or what are your question is what are we using now? And so I think the answer there is if we're only concerned with styling. Um, I've seen this again. I first saw this in Radix, but Radix has this idea of data attributes. So when a component library, when its internal state changes, they instead of yielding out a variable in JSX, they'll just apply a data attribute to that element in the DOM. And then if you want to style that element, well, you can write CSS that targets things with data attributes. Headless UI does this as well. So they have a great example here. When the menu is active, they're going to add a data active property. I guess it would be an attribute onto the button. And you can target it with Tailwind using something like data active background blue 200. And so, yeah, just looking at this code, this is a lot. It's less code.
It's a
And
lot less code. It's a
it's a
lot
lot less
easier to
code.
read.
And the styling, it's kind of interesting here, too. I just kind of realized reading this. The styling the styling logic or the styling behavior is all in the class name attribute. And so you can, that's kind of where you look for styling, right? Like if you want to know how something's styled, you class name is one of the first places you look. Where if you look at the render prop example, there's like function call, JSX, and class name. So a lot more like you have to think across a lot wider of a scope, I guess.
I think that's a great point. Just looking at these two, again, just to describe on audio, like for those not looking, the JSX has the menu button, and then it has this whole function, render prop. It's children as a function inside the menu button and the links, and you're destructuring this. It feels logicful. It feels like a logicful part of your JSX. Whereas with data attributes, you get to keep it to class name, exactly like you just said. I think that's an awesome observation because um, the fact that the menu button is active or the drop down menu is open or the menu item is focused, it feels more like a pseudo state, a CSS pseudo state, right? It feels like a
Yeah.
styling pseudo state of your app, and people already use CSS to style apps. CSS has pseudo states like hover and focus and active. And so it's actually great that you don't have to, use is focused, use is hovered every time you write a button in anywhere in your React apps, and then you conditionally add or remove classes based on that hook, that custom hook. It's nice that you can just say colon hovered in Tailwind, or if you're just writing CSS, you can just use colon hovered the pseudo state directly. Um, so I think this is a really great point. Using render props to control the pseudo states, the styling pseudo states of your component, and they could be kind of custom pseudo states, right? Like Aria is pressed We're looking at headless UI. It has active and focus, but they mean slightly different things than the actual CSS pseudostates, but still conceptually they are. It's a very nice way to just use a data attribute and to write that CSS that targets it. And that's all we're using the render props right here for, and it's a lot cleaner. So that's maybe like another 35% of if the first 50% use case for render props was sharing behavior and logic, and hooks replaced it for that. You've got another 30% that is for customizing styling when based on when your component is in some pseudo state, like narrowly styling the CSS. Data attributes takes care of that. And I think everyone would agree looking at this, they prefer to write something like this. So what is left? Why are render props, again, still mentioned? Why are we talking about them? Where are they used? I think it's interesting looking at this example from Headless UI. It's a good follow-up to last week where we were talking about controlled and uncontrolled components. And when you fully take control of something and you have your own state, maybe a custom hook, you are controlling it, like in the slider example, the color picker example we talked about, you are taking control of the source of truth. And now you have it. And like you said, you can now make your app reactive based on that state. That's why you want to control it. But you probably want to do a lot of things. And taking ownership, making an uncontrolled component controlled, there's sometimes a large step there. And even more so with libraries like Headless and Radix or form libraries, things that are pretty high level, pretty abstract. They have a lot of complicated internal logic. Right here, you can see it's pretty cool that we just get the active state without having to take control of this. We're still rendering menu button, and menu items as uncontrolled components, but they're yielding out specific slices of their internal state to let us to use to just add some light customizations. So it's kind of like we get a little window into the internal state of these complex components, but we get to do it in a way that doesn't require us to take full ownership. And that is where render props are still useful. They're useful for peeking into uncontrolled components in a lightweight way. And kind of one of the most common ways that we see them being used for that purpose is with forms. So I'm over here on the Radix docs now, and we're looking at the Radix form component, which is in preview, but I've used it before. It's actually really great. They have an example of rendering a form field, form.field, form.label, and a form.validity state. The validity state is going to, again, expose some internal state so that you can see whether this input is in a valid or not valid state. And by using the render prop, you get that validity state right here, and you get to customize this text field input, which is a separate component completely, comes from like a UI library, and you get to tell this text field input whether it should be like state error or state success.
Yeah. Also, I just want to call out here, we're looking at a capital F form component with
Yes.
form.field label. This is just a small little thing on the page, but you could imagine you'd have a lot of these, form with like 5 or 6 elements. Man, there is a lot of uncontrolled state in these components. What's focused? Things like you want live validation, but you don't want to show that until the user is like focused and moved away. So there's
or submitted even submitted the form once. You want to wait until it's blurred or something like that.
And when you reach for form libraries like this, you want to just push all that work onto. You want an uncontrolled component. You want to just push all that work into the form library. So if you want to customize something based off the error message, like I guess based off our conversation last week, it's like, okay, you have to take control of the error message. They're using the validity state API, which is like a browser API here built into the browser, but you would take control over that. But yeah, this, as you said, this is like a great way for you to peek into an uncontrolled component.
Mm-hmm. And there's another example here from React Aria forms. They have this field error component. Now, interestingly, we haven't talked about compound components yet on the podcast recently, but that's going to be another topic of the course. You can see in Radix has this compound component pattern where you import a form from Radix and then you render form.field, form.label, form.validity state. Compound components, I don't think it's an official term. I don't think you'll find it in the React docs, but it's just a pattern that the community has developed as a way to signal that these things are related. You can know that a form.label belongs in the form.field. It's just kind of an indication. It's an affordance that these components belong together and that they probably share some state without you having to manage it. So that usually you would use compound components when you want some shared state. Here in React Aria, we have a form, text field, and label. These aren't compound. They are just like basically mapped to the native inputs. And yet we're still doing the same thing. We have a field error component. And instead of us having to take control of any of this, we get to keep it uncontrolled. It's just great. And it's just yielding out the validation details, presumably from, the inputs that have requirements and stuff. Like this text field is required. Yeah, that's exactly where it's coming from. So you can see here, text field renders a name and it is required. But if I try to submit it, it's going to know it's an error, and field error gets that. But I get to tell it, hey, I'm going to say, please enter a name. I can make this say whatever I want. So it's still like unstyled in that sense. I get the details, but I get to use them as uncontrolled components. One thing I'm thinking of right now is like based on our conversation last week and this week, and a lot of what the React 19 team talked about at ReactConf with things like use optimistic and the forgiving programming model that it gives us about just basically discarding long-lived state as much as possible. State is kind of the root of all evil. Like you just kind of want to eliminate as much state as possible. And if you need something like a use form hook that you pass the props into your own form, it's easy for you to fall into this trap where you are now managing the state yourself. And if you're managing the state yourself, you need to be very careful about cleaning it up, keeping it synchronized, or not trying to duplicate it. Rendering uncontrolled components. I mean, it's like the easiest thing ever. That's why HTML is so easy, because there's like no state that you have to think about. And so I think this is an awesome use case for render props. They let you peek at the internal state without taking control of it.
Super interesting. Very, very good point. And two, you can imagine like, okay, for an input, what is it? For an input and its value, its state is very simple, right? It's like a string or whatever the type of the input is, type number, type text. But for like a form, a really big form with a whole bunch of fields, and then what is the shape of that form's errors? Is it like a list? Is it an object with keys? That's something that like whatever library you're using is going to decide. But then if they're going to allow you to take ownership of that and make it like fully controlled, now they have to have like a public API. They have to make a public API. You have to honor that public API. Man, they want to change something. Like they had it as an object with keys and now they want to go to a list. That's a breaking change. But with render props, they can expose slices of that data structure without actually exposing the whole data structure. So not only is it easier for you as a programmer because you don't have to manage any state, it's also easier for them because they can just say, yeah, you really just want like this one validity state object. I'm just going to show this to you without exposing the entire state, all the use states inside my capital F form component.
I think that's a great point. It basically gives you a way to have a more limited public interface to your component. With the color picker example from last week, we had an on change and then like an on commit, which happened like once you let go or submit the new color, and then you could dismiss it. That's like, I want to expose those two things so that you can take full control of this component. And that's easy because there's two props. It's the color and it's on color change commit, or on color commit, on change commit, let's say. That's a great API. And if I'm using Ryan's color picker, that's what I want to use because I want to have full control over. I can use it to render frame of motion, this and that. That makes sense. With forms, like you said, you don't want to take full control over it. So I think this is a nice place to mention the documents in React. The React dev docs here actually mention render props in kind of the context we were talking about before, where you want to share some data or logic. It's actually, you'll find it on the clone element page, which is like, has a huge pitfall call out because you basically shouldn't ever use this. But the idea is you want someone to be able to customize, for example, the list items. You could think of the field errors in the form field example. And the render prop is a nice alternative to that. And it's basically choosing which slice of your internal state you want to expose as a public API. And it's just nice because, like you said, with the complex stuff, you have this error object. It especially, I think, is useful when you are in a larger chunk of JSX or a complex component like a form. You'll see here, they highlight in their example when they kind of go from passing data with a render prop to the when they go from the clone element to the render prop. It's just easy to trace your logic with the internal state of the component. Whereas you can imagine having a big form, having to take full control over it with something like, use form library and then passing it in. And now you're taking ownership of the on changes, the validity state change. It's going to be harder to just follow all that because you're almost becoming like a library author at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, yeah, exactly. You're following the rules of the library and yeah. Yep.
Yep. I think just to wrap up, one thing that we talked about while we were prepping for this is the fact that, render props are something that is a tool. But it's a pretty limited use case where the tool applies. If 50% of the use case of render props was sharing behavior and stateful logic, that's now taken over by hooks. If 30% was customizing styling, that's taken over by data attributes. I mean, it's pretty surprising how far data attributes gets you when you're doing something like styling the pseudo state of a component. But once you need to actually customize the output, the actual output, in a way that kind of goes beyond the pseudo state, you need to render a custom input based on the validity state of this particular field. And this field is far down in a tree that's full of form components. You could always do that with a hook. And the React docs mention that basically passing data with a render prop is an alternative to extracting logic into a custom hook. But I think the way we would think about it is most of the time, kind of like your midwit meme example, most of the time just calling use state, passing it in, it's going to be the best thing. It's just so easy to understand. It's easy to use. You're not trying to keep something under controlled, but then control it and it's just, you're taking control of it. It makes the data flow easy. Every React developer understands use state. Render props are, they're a little bit sharper than that. But there's this case where you have a very complex tree, maybe a complex component system, and you just want to get a window into that internal state. And I think that's where we would suggest render props could be a very useful, very helpful tool.
Yeah. And it is interesting that these form libraries we've been looking at, Radix and React Aria, both use them for the error messages.
Right.
And so it's because that, and if you think about it, the error messages you want error messages in a form are interesting because it is something where like you don't want to control because that is all going to be internal to the form, but you do want to customize them.
Right.
You absolutely want to customize them.
Yep.
So this is a way where you can get just a little slice into there. And not only do you want to customize them, it's usually want to customize the display of them. So you want to display some icons or some different fonts or whatever.
UI components in different variants based on something. It's kind of like you get that peak, you get to map it to whatever you need, and then it's just a lightweight way to connect them. Cool. I think next week we'll talk about compound components, but just as a final thought here, another way that you can think about render props is almost like a lightweight slots API. If you've used, we use Ember, and Ember has this API called contextual components, which lets you render basically slots. Vue has something called slots, I think explicitly. I think Svelte might as well. So a lot of times, the first time people are starting out with a UI library, they quickly want something like slots for maybe rendering a tab list or putting a card in a different state. And I want the card header and the card body and the card footer, but I want to share the padding. And React doesn't have any API that's kind of a blessed API for doing something like that, because you can do it with the tools that React gives you. So there's basically, most of the time in React, there's really one way to do things, and the higher level patterns are kind of emerge from the community. A render prop is basically a way to pass slots. You can think of it like that. And it doesn't have to be a function even. You could give it JSX. Or I guess a render prop is a function, but the first step is you can imagine passing like card header, card body, card footer, and just passing in JSX. And then if you want to be able to customize those three props could be render props in the sense that they are functions that yield out, again, slices of the internal state so that you can use them to customize them. Most of the times with render props, you see them in the children field right here, which is just in the middle of the tags of the component that is accepting the render prop, the component that is yielding out the slice of state. But in the React docs, you'll actually see it passed in as something called render item. It's literally a prop, and it takes in a function. So it's kind of cool because maybe if you're listening to this, you've only ever seen render props from libraries and only ever seen them in the body of children, but you can actually have arbitrary amount of render props to a component. And it's kind of a way to think about a lightweight way to do slots. And then compound components are kind of like, I think, like the level up from that in terms of they're just a little bit nicer. They look nicer. They're nicer to use. They don't feel like a programming language inside of your declarative part of your component. And I think most people prefer them for that reason. You know, something else you said at the beginning, which is like with a function, you can come up with any API you want. React is just JavaScript in the sense that your whole component is running arbitrary code. So we don't have the separation like other frameworks do between a template language that is like deliberately underpowered, something like an HTML basically, or handlebars or something like that, versus the logic. It's all just JavaScript. But still, I think both both for folks starting out, but also experienced folks, you'll see this separation in terms of organization about the imperative or the logic or the derived state happening at the top of your component, and then your render function, the render part of your component, the return value, being as declarative as possible. So I think that's another kind of argument in favor of patterns that favor that just look like HTML, and render props is a bit of a sharper knife here, but it definitely has its use cases.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I really like the slots. I really like them as a way to introduce slots. You have a card, and it takes card image, card title, and it's hard to card is interesting because it's like hard to think what internal state
What state
card
it would
was.
have, right? It could have
Yeah,
like an active. It could have like you render cards and then it's active and it like zooms up and like the thing go and you want to change the shadow or something like that. But yeah, card is not like what's I'm trying to think. What's an example of the first time you need slots, or like the first time we needed slots in Ember? Um,
man, it's
Collapsible
always like
panel.
yeah. It's always like It's always like some customization thing where it's like we have this really complex
You want the
component.
chevron to rotate when it's open or closed, right?
Yeah,
For a
that's a good one.
collapsible
Yeah.
panel. And so you could do that with a render prop, and you can do that as a slot. Like if it's open, I want the text to be bold and the chevron to be rotated down. Otherwise, it's the same. And so
And
yeah,
there's a nice composition pattern here because your card title or your card icon, if it's a render prop, you can now pass in like frame or motion components to it.
exactly. Yep. Cool. I really like this kind of like the hierarchy. It's helping me understand like the best way to teach all these patterns because they kind of build in a lot of ways. And the
It's so
conversation we had last week is like just so important to understanding a lot of this stuff.
there's definitely a choose your own adventure here with all these components. So there's no like, oh, you introduce A, then B, then C. It's interesting.
Yep. But cool. So hopefully that was kind of helpful. I think a little bit of the history lesson there helps. And maybe if you're working on an app that uses a lot of render props and you haven't kind of acquainted yourself with other patterns like hooks or even the data attributes, again, to me, it was very surprising how much simpler and how much code was eliminated once I started using just data attributes for all sorts of stuff. It really is nice, especially if you use Tailwind, but I think even otherwise. But render props are definitely good to understand. They definitely have a place, and yeah, just another tool in the tool belt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. All right, let's wrap it up there. If you have any questions, hit us up at Front and First FM on Twitter, and we'll be back next week to talk about compound components.
Cool. See ya.
All right, bye.